My name is Renata and I was 38 the autumn I co-signed my own erasure. That is the cleanest way I know to say it. Not that I was fooled exactly, not that I was ignorant. I was neither of those things, and that is what made it so precise an injury. The way Marcus knew I would trust the document because I trusted him, and the way that trust had been 31 months in the making, built out of shared dinners and a mortgage application and a ring I still wore on my left hand every single morning I drove myself to work at the county assessor's office where I spent my days reading property records for other people's land. He knew where I worked. He had kissed me at that desk once, on a Tuesday, brought me a sandwich I did not ask for, and leaned over the partition and made the two women in the neighboring cubicles laugh at something I no longer remember. He knew that I could read a deed the way a mechanic reads an engine. He filed the modification anyway, he handed me the pen anyway. I am going to tell you exactly what happened and exactly why I did not fall apart. My mother was a woman who owned precisely 4 beautiful things in her life, and she knew the value of each one and she told me that value out loud, so I would not waste a single year not knowing what I was standing on. One of those things was a property on the eastern edge of a county that most people from outside it cannot find on a map without squinting. A 2-acre parcel with an old access road and a plum tree she had planted the year her own mother died, because that was how she metabolized grief, by digging something into the ground that would outlast her. That land had been hers since 1989. The deed transferred to me the year she died, which was 6 years before I met Marcus, and which I have never stopped being grateful for, because if the timing had been different, I am not certain the story would have ended the way it did. I kept the transfer deed and a file I made myself when I was 22 and new to the assessor's office and still learning what documents were worth protecting and which ones just needed to be saved. The file was pale green, with a red label I had typed on the office label maker on my first week, and it said, Land, Modernal, in capital letters, and I kept it between the wall and my nightstand for 11 years because I wanted to be able to put my hand on it in the dark without getting up. That file is the object this story turns on, not the land itself though, the land matters. The file. The way it felt when I slid it out in the dark to check it was still there, the weight of it. The smell of old paper and something that still registered to my nose as my mother's house, even after all those years. Marcus came into my life on a Thursday in late October. I know the day because I had worked a long week and stayed past 6, and was walking to my car in the parking structure and he was trying to find a space and had pulled up alongside me and asked if I knew where the overflow lot was. I told him, he thanked me. He showed up at the same parking structure 4 days later, which I did not think was strange at the time, because I was not yet the kind of woman who thought in terms of patterns. I was just tired and he was pleasant, and he knew how to have a conversation without making it feel like an audition. We were married 17 months after that parking structure. Not because I rushed. Because I was 36 and I had been alone for a long time and I had done the work of becoming someone who did not need to be told they were enough. And so when I met someone who felt aligned, I did not see any reason to manufacture obstacles. My best friend Celia thought he was charming. My colleague at the assessor's office, a man named Dwight who had worked there for 19 years and had a gift for understated assessments of human beings, told me once that Marcus always seemed to be calculating something. I thanked him for the observation. I did not act on it. That is the moment I would revisit later, sitting in the dark with the green file in my hands, asking myself what I had chosen not to see. The first year of the marriage was ordinary in the way most first years are, the adjustment of 2 lives taking up the same space, the small negotiations about what belongs where, the slow revision of habits that were formed in solitude. Marcus made money in commercial real estate brokerage, or said he did, and for a long time I took that claim at face value because he had a phone that rang and an office he went to, and a vocabulary that sounded right. He talked about properties the way I talked about properties, in terms of parcels and easements and recorded covenants, and I found that comfortable because familiar things feel like safety even when they are not. He asked me about my mother's parcel in the 3rd month of our marriage, not in any way that alarmed me. He asked because I had mentioned it, because it was one of the few things I could not stop mentioning, the way you cannot stop mentioning a person who shaped you even after they are gone. I told him the acreage. I told him about the plum tree. I told him the assessed value which I knew to the dollar because I had looked it up the week after the transfer, the way you learn a number that matters. He nodded and asked good questions, and I thought he was interested in me. I am going to be honest here, I thought he loved me. And for a certain period he may have, in whatever way he was capable of it. The cruelty came later. The calculation may have been there from the beginning. I cannot know for certain which came first, and I have made my peace with not knowing. Understanding why a person does something is not the same as forgiving it, and I have chosen to understand without forgiving, and that choice has held. Welcome back to the Calm Revenge episodes, where the stories we tell are about the quiet ones who stayed steady when everything around them tilted. This episode is about a woman who knew exactly what she owned and had the paperwork to prove it, and how that knowledge was the only thing her husband never managed to take. If this is your first time here, I am glad you found it. Leave a comment and subscribe so the next story finds you before someone else needs it more. The marriage turned in the second year, not dramatically, not the way I had seen turns happen in other people's lives, with a single loud event that everyone pointed to afterward. It turned the way a staircase settles, one step at a time, imperceptibly, until one morning you notice the creak under your foot that was not there before, and you understand that something structural has shifted. Marcus began talking about the land, not asking about it. Talking about it in a way that presumed it was already partly his. He would say things like, "We ought to get that assessed again, the market has moved," and "I know a developer who has been looking for access road parcels out in that area," and always when I redirected him, he would say the same thing in the same tone of patient certainty. "Renata, I am only trying to think about our future." He said that sentence 17 times over the following 9 months. I counted, not because I was planning anything at the time, but because I work with records and I have a professional instinct toward documentation that had been trained into me over 14 years, the way a nurse has an instinct to check a pulse, the way it happens almost before you decide to do it. I am only trying to think about our future. The second time he said it was over dinner with his brother Caleb and Caleb's wife, a thin woman named Sandra, who managed Marcus the way you manage a complicated appliance with a careful set of button presses and the look of permanent readiness for the moment it overheats. Caleb had been involved in Marcus's business for years, or adjacent to it, the way some men are, adjacent to other men's ambitions. He ran a title and settlement company that had processed, I would learn much later, a number of transactions that had not been cleanly documented. Sandra pushed the food around her plate and said very little and looked at me twice across the table with the expression of someone who has information they have decided you are not ready for. I thought about that look for a long time afterward. Caleb was the one who suggested the property consolidation. That was what he called it. He brought it up over dessert after 2 bottles of wine, and he used a word I had never heard applied to a straightforward deed modification. Streamlining, he said, as in, it would streamline everything if the property were under both names now that you're building a life together. Marcus nodded, as though this were something they had not rehearsed. I said I would think about it. I noticed, at a small remove, the way one professional notices the behavior of another professional, doing work they have not announced, that both men had moved slightly forward in their chairs. I think about that dinner the way you think about a test you did not know you were taking. What they did not know, because I had not mentioned it and had no reason to mention it, was that I worked in the county assessor's office. Not on the residential side. On the administrative and records side, which meant I spent my days understanding not just what property was worth, but how property moved. How it was titled, how modifications were processed, how easements were attached, how errors were corrected, and specifically how a fraudulent modification, if one were ever filed against a parcel I owned, would leave a record trail that could be read by anyone who knew what they were looking at. Which I did. I went home that night and I sat with the green file and I held it the way I sometimes held it when I needed to feel steady, which is not a habit I am embarrassed about. My mother had sat in the same darkness in the house I grew up in and held things that mattered to her, and it had made her unbreakable, and I understood now that it made me unbreakable too. I said nothing to Marcus about what I had noticed. I gave him nothing to recalibrate against. 6 weeks after that dinner, Marcus came home with a document. He said it was a routine household financial consolidation, a joint asset registration required by his lender for a business refinancing he was doing, and he needed my signature on 2 places. He had highlighted them in yellow. He had already signed his own name. The document was 11 pages and he handed it to me with a pen and said we needed to submit it by 9 the next morning. I looked at page 1 and page 3 and page 7 before I looked at pages 8 and 9. Pages 8 and 9 were the deed modification. Caleb's company's letterhead was on page 10. I signed it. I want to be precise about that because I know how it sounds and I want you to understand why I did it. I signed it because I had spent 4 days I have not mentioned yet, 4 days that happened between the dinner and the document's arrival, doing something Marcus had no idea I had done. I had gone into the county record system, which I accessed every day as part of my work, and I had located every transaction that Caleb's settlement company had processed in the past 3 years. I had done a title history on the parcel. I had spoken quietly to a real property attorney named Vera, who kept an office 6 blocks from the assessor's building and who had a reputation for brevity and accuracy, and for never saying one more word than a situation required. Vera wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she had a habit of setting her pen down on her notepad with a particular click when she was finished listening and ready to speak, and the click meant, "I have what I need." I had signed it because I had already, 4 days before Marcus handed me that pen, taken the action that made his modification irrelevant. He did not know that yet. I let it run. That phrase, "I let it run," is the phrase I return to when I need to remember who I was in those months, what quality I was calling on, what it actually felt like to hold the thing I knew and let him proceed with the thing he did not. It felt like sitting very still while a current moved around me. It felt like every year of working at a desk that taught me patience with information. Information that does not hurry. Information that arrives in its own time. Information that waits and is still waiting when the person who underestimated it finally looks up. The deed modification was recorded on a Tuesday. I watched it post in the record system from my desk, the way you watch the mail come in. Marcus called me at 11 that morning to ask if I had eaten and to say he loved me. I told him I had eaten. I said I loved him too because I did not yet know the full shape of what he was doing, only its outline, and even then some part of me was still accounting for the possibility that I had misjudged. I had not. But the part of me that wanted to be wrong was still working, and I gave it its time, and eventually it stopped. If you have ever been in a situation where the person closest to you was building something against you with materials you provided, your trust, your name, your history, and you had to decide whether to burn it down immediately or let it complete itself and show you exactly what it was, then you know what those weeks felt like. If you have been there, leave a word in the comments, not a sentence, just the word that describes the feeling. I will read every one of them, because this channel exists for the people who have been in that particular kind of still. What is coming next is the part where Marcus's own actions became the thing that mattered most. The modification had done what Caleb needed it to do for the refinancing. I understood that within 2 weeks of watching the paperwork move. Marcus had used my property, the parcel, my mother's 2 acres, the plum tree, as collateral security on a business loan of $217,000 that he had taken through Caleb's company and which he had not disclosed to me, and for which he had used the modification to establish a joint interest that he then represented as mine. The loan had been drawn 6 days after the deed change posted. I found this in the records the way I found everything, methodically, one document at a time, the way you read a property history when you are trying to understand what a piece of land has been through. I sat with that number, $217,000, against 2 acres of land that were worth, at the market value Marcus himself had cited over dinner, approximately $190,000, against land he had pledged without my informed consent, against land that carried a plum tree my mother had planted in grief. That was the most expensive mistake of his life, and he had no idea yet. Vera met with me again on a Thursday morning, 8 days after I had confirmed the loan amount. She wore the glasses on the chain. She set her pen down on the notepad with a click that meant she was ready. She had a stack of documents I had provided in a folder beside her, title history, the modification record, the loan application Caleb had filed, and a collection of text messages between Marcus and Caleb that Marcus had sent from a shared tablet he had forgotten I could access, messages that discussed my property by assessed value 3 months before the dinner and 5 months before the dinner and 5 months before the modification, messages that contained the phrase, "She won't read the full doc," twice, messages that showed a calculation of how much collateral they need. Vera looked at me over the glasses without lifting her head from the documents. She said, "He used your professional knowledge as a reason to trust him. and used your trust as a reason not to read what he handed you. I said, yes. She said, and the pre-filing action you took means the modification affected a secondary interest only, not the primary title. I said, yes. She picked up the pen. She did not click it. She said, he wrote his own verdict. He just never read it back. That sentence settled into me the way facts settle, without fanfare, without relief. Just as a true statement that the situation had already confirmed and that Vera had simply found the words for. I was not glad. I was not relieved. I was very precisely what I had been for the past 9 months, still. What Vera had confirmed, what I had spent 14 years of professional training being prepared to understand and 4 months of careful record checking being prepared to prove, was this, because I had visited Vera 4 days before I signed the modification, and because at that visit I had executed a protective transfer instrument that she held in custody. The modification Marcus had me sign had attached only to a remainder interest I had already documented as subordinate. The primary title had not moved. It could not be liened without my separate notarized consent, which I had not provided and would not provide, because I had structured the subordinate interest specifically to accommodate the modification that I could see coming, without handing him the title that mattered. I had handed him the pen because I already knew what the pen could not reach. Marcus did not know any of this for 4 more months. Those 4 months are not dramatic from the outside. From the outside they looked like a marriage continuing. We had dinner, we watched television. He talked about the loan and the refinancing and once asked me, in a tone that was so casual it had to have been practiced, whether I had any concerns about the property being used as part of a business arrangement, and I told him calmly that I trusted his judgment, and I watched his face relax, and I said nothing else. Those months are the ones I am most honestly ashamed of, not because I was doing anything wrong but because there is a particular discomfort in knowing that a person you married is willing to use you while they smile at you, and choosing to let that knowledge sit in your chest rather than in a courtroom, and knowing the difference between letting it run and simply enduring it. I chose correctly. I know that it was still a cost. Caleb began applying pressure in February. The loan was underperforming. The development deal had not closed on time, or had closed at the wrong terms, or something structural had failed in the way that Marcus's larger ventures always eventually failed, which I had been learning to see in the months of careful observation. Caleb wanted the collateral formalized. He wanted Vera's office to confirm the lien was clean. He called our landline once when Marcus was not home, and he said my name the way someone says a name they have been using in conversations they never expected the named person to hear, and I said, I will have my attorney reach out. There was a pause. He said, your attorney? I said, yes. He hung up. I am not going to say I did not feel something then. A kind of cold steadiness that is its own form of satisfaction but is not warm enough to be happiness and not sharp enough to be triumph. A clarity. The kind of clarity that comes not from winning but from having been right about what was coming and having already positioned yourself before it arrived. Marcus was furious when I told him I had spoken to an attorney. Not because he said so, he said very little for 3 days, but because the calculation changed on his face in a way I had learned to read. The way you learn to read any face you have studied for 30 months. He was recalculating. He did not have enough information to know how bad it was going to be. He was estimating, and his estimates were wrong because he was estimating based on his understanding of the asset, which was based on the modification, which was based on his confidence that I had not read the full document. She will not read the full doc, he tried once, in that 3-day silence, to explain. He sat down across from me with the measured patience of someone who has rehearsed sincerity and said that the loan was a business necessity and that the consolidation was just a formality and that everything he did was for our future, and that sentence, I am only trying to think about our future, came out of his mouth the way it always did, in that particular smooth register that I had once found reassuring and now recognized as the sound of someone reading from a script they wrote without you. I looked at him steadily. I said, I know you believe that. He took that as acceptance. He should not have. To anyone here who has ever had someone use the word future as a reason why you should not ask questions about the present, you know exactly what that moment felt like. Subscribe so this finds the next person who needs it. Because the next person who needs it is sitting somewhere right now being told their concerns are small and their future is assured, and their name on a document is just a formality. Vera filed the challenge on a Monday. The basis was straightforward, as basis for fraud challenges usually are when they are properly documented: unauthorized use of a subordinated interest, misrepresented as a primary title, in support of a loan application that contained material misrepresentations about the nature of the collateral. The text messages provided the element of premeditation. The title, history, provided the element of knowledge. The modification itself provided the element of misrepresentation. The loan application, filed by Caleb's company, provided the element of the instrument used to execute it. Together these things made up a record that told the story precisely. The way records always tell the story precisely when someone has been careful enough to let them accumulate. Caleb received notice on a Wednesday. Marcus received his on a Thursday. I was at work when he called. I let it go to voicemail. His voice on the voicemail was the voice of someone who has opened a door expecting one room and found another, much larger room with a very different floor plan, and I listened to it once and then I went back to the records I was processing. The confrontation happened at a deposition that Vera had scheduled for the following month, in a small conference room at a title dispute mediation firm on the 4th floor of a building downtown, a room with a long table and a window that faced the parking structure where I had met Marcus, and a bowl of hard candies at the center of the table that no one touched. Caleb was there, Sandra was there. The lender's attorney was there. Marcus was there. I sat at one end of the table with Vera and did not speak until I was asked to speak. Marcus was loud. He was loud in the restrained professional way that men who are accustomed to being believed in rooms like this are loud when they are not being believed, not shouting but pressing, interrupting, redirecting, using the vocabulary of reasonableness to accomplish the effect of force. He said that the modification was mutual. He said that I had understood its purpose. He said that the protective transfer instrument was a unilateral action that I had taken in bad faith, designed to frustrate a legitimate business arrangement. He said this with the same certainty he had used to say, I am only trying to think about our future, and I noticed the pattern in it the way I notice patterns in records, not with emotion, almost from a distance the way I notice a filing inconsistency when I am reviewing a deed chain. The small misalignment that tells you something upstream has moved without being documented. When it was my turn to speak, I said 2 sentences. I said, the protective transfer was executed before the modification was filed. The modification attached to nothing. That was the entirety of what I said. Vera laid the title history on the table. She laid the execution date of the protective transfer on the table. She laid the recording dates side by side. She did not explain them, she let them sit there. Marcus looked at the dates. His attorney said something to him quietly that I could not hear. Caleb said loudly enough that Sandra put her hand on his arm. You told me she hadn't done anything with the property. And Marcus said she hadn't. And Caleb said, then what is this? And Marcus had no answer. Because the answer was that he had been so certain I had not read the full document that he had never considered the possibility that I had already written the next one. Sandra left the room before the session formally closed. She did not look at Marcus when she left. She looked at the bowl of hard candies. She took one. She walked out. I watched Marcus's face as the dates on the table refused to rearrange themselves. I felt something that I will not call satisfaction and will not call grief. I felt the peculiar completeness of a thing that has run its full course. The way a document that has passed through every required office finally bears every required stamp, and there is nothing left to do with it except file it. I stood and put on my coat, and Vera gathered the documents into her case, and I walked to the door. Marcus called my name once in the hallway. I did not turn around. This was not coldness, it was accuracy. There was nothing in that room or in that voice that I still needed to hear. The lender accepted the title evidence. The lien was invalidated on the grounds that the collateral had been misrepresented. Caleb's company faced a regulatory referral from the lender's own compliance office, which I had not anticipated and did not pursue, but also did not prevent. The loan obligation remained Marcus's individually, which had been the structural reality all along. The parcel came through the process exactly as it had entered it. 2 acres, clear title, a plum tree along the eastern edge, worth $190,000 on the current market. Because Marcus had attempted to lien it, The challenge had established and recorded the protective transfer permanently and prominently in the title history, which added a layer of legal documentation that, ironically, made the parcel easier to insure and cleaner to sell or borrow against than it had been before he touched it. His action, designed to take the land, had instead sharpened the record of my ownership of it in a way that 11 years of careful maintenance alone had not fully achieved. Vera said this without any change in her expression, which I respected. The total cost to him, the $217,000 loan, remained in default. His brokerage license was placed under review because the lender's compliance referral produced an inquiry into how he had represented properties in prior transactions. Caleb's settlement company closed 6 months later, and the marriage, which had already been a structure without a foundation, was formalized as ended by a process that took 4 months and cost me $4,400 in legal fees and cost him considerably more in a way that Vera had structured carefully, and that I will not detail here except to say that it was proportionate. He called 3 times after the divorce was finalized. He did not leave messages after the first call, which contained the phrase, "I am only trying to think about what's fair." A variation on the sentence that told me, if I had needed any additional confirmation, that the sentence had not been about our future or about fairness but had been, always, about whatever Marcus wanted to justify at the moment he said it. I did not pick up. Dwight, who had told me 2 years earlier that Marcus always seemed to be calculating something, said nothing when I returned to the office after the deposition. He nodded once from his desk in a way that contained 11 syllables worth of meaning and handed me a stack of records to process. I sat down and I processed them. That felt, in the plainest sense, correct. Celia came over the following Saturday with a container of soup I did not ask for, which is the truest measure of a person who loves you. They bring what you need without waiting for you to name it. We sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours and I told her most of it and she asked good questions and one said, "You already knew when you signed it, didn't you?" And I said yes, and she said nothing after that because there was nothing that needed to be said. The green file. The pale green folder with the red label that says, Land, Maternal in capital letters, lives on my kitchen counter now, not between the wall and the nightstand. I moved it there the week after the deposition because I wanted it where I could see it when I made coffee in the morning, not in the dark. I wanted it in daylight. I wanted it horizontal and visible and not something I had to reach for in secret. It is a small thing. It is the specific small thing that the last 4 years of my life revolved around without my choosing, that and with my making peace with it. A neighbor's child asked me last spring what was in the folder, a girl named May who comes over sometimes to use the printer for school projects. I told her it was the record of something my mother had owned and that I owned now. She asked what kind of record. I told her it was a deed, which is a document that says this belongs to you and tells the whole truth about how it got there. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Do you keep the record because you might forget or because other people might?" I told her, "Because other people might." She nodded as though that was the obvious answer, and maybe it was. There is a kind of property that is not about land, it is about what you know about what belongs to you and your capacity to prove it, and the patience to let the proof speak when the moment requires it. The land is not what the story is about, even though the land is real and the plum tree is real, and I visited it last month and it had fruit on it, dark and ripe, the kind my mother used to bring in and put on the table without comment, just set them down so everyone could have some. The person who showed up when it mattered was Vera, who never once told me what I wanted to hear but told me, every single time, exactly what was true. She returned the protective transfer instrument to me after the divorce was finalized, a formality since the instrument had already served its purpose, but she printed it on new paper and put it in a clean folder and handed it to me across her desk with the click of the pen that meant she was finished and I was complete. I put it in the green folder. It lives there now, on the kitchen counter. The morning I write this, I made coffee and I stood at the counter and I put my hand on the green folder the way I used to put my hand on it in the dark, except now it is morning and the light is coming through the kitchen window and there is nothing I need to confirm. It is there. I know it is there. There is a difference between reaching for something in the dark to make sure it has not been taken and resting your hand on something in the light, because it is yours and it has always been yours, and the record says so and the record is right. The documents that protect you are built in the quiet, in the ordinary hours, before the person who wants to take from you has made their move. That is not a lesson I would have put into words before all of this. I would have simply said, keep your records, but it is larger than that. It is about knowing what you have built and choosing not to announce it, not because you are ashamed of it, but because some things do their best work in the silence before the challenge comes. The land is still there. The plum tree had fruit this year. May got an A on the project she printed. The folder is on the counter. The coffee is still warm.